None of us go looking for something inconvenient in life. As a matter of fact, we try and avoid it as much as we can. We're going to talk about how inconvenient is really a part of discovering how to be refreshed with joy during this particular season of life. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to December 13th, 2020 and our Web Weekend podcast for Kingston Standard Church. It is great to have you with us and be able to connect in this setting today. And I want to remind you of our teaching videos that are a part of our kids ministry that are available on Facebook for Cabin Kids. And so you can check that out. If you just do a search on Facebook for Cabin Kids, you'll find all of the information and the videos that are available there for you as well. In the next few minutes, we're going to jump into our continuing adventure with Advent Online. And as we expectantly work our way toward the week of Jesus' birth, we are excited to be able to explore these different aspects of faith and look forward greatly to what God is teaching us in this time. We've been talking about how Christmas has a lot of images that are a part of it, and refreshed is not usually one of them. As a matter of fact, burnout is probably a more accurate word. We find that we've burned out our money, we've burned out our energy, we've burned out all kinds of things, and by the time we get to January and February, we think that the blues are probably the best thing we've got going for us. And so it's interesting as we come into this time and explore what it would mean to be refreshed at Christmas. And today we're talking about refreshing joy. Thanks for joining us. Let's jump in. As I mentioned in the intro today, there's a lot of things about life that are inconvenient, and we work our way through life really seeking to eliminate as much of the inconvenience that is a part of our lives as possible and try and make things convenient for ourselves. And oftentimes that can't be the case when it comes to larger projects or things that really require a lot of extra effort to be able to see them be followed through on. This year, in the house we live in, we've done a variety of different kinds of renovations, and one of those was a renovation I did in the basement, and it involved enclosing a space and a variety of different kinds of things. And as we got started, it was around the time that COVID really kicked in, and so there were questions about materials, there were questions about being able to follow through and get the help that we needed and all those kinds of things. And in the midst of that time, I really debated heavy as to whether or not I would just follow through. I mean, this is going to get messy. Is it going to be too much work? Is it something that is really going to be all that worthwhile? And I had all kinds of reasons as to why I shouldn't start. And even as I got into it, there were all kinds of reasons why I maybe should just stop and not continue at that point. And there are so many different things that are a part of our lives that are hard to either get started or even continue with. Now, I can say as it relates to this project, I'm so glad that I finished it up. And now that I look back, I learned so much about new materials, about different resources for materials, about working with a variety of things that I hadn't done before. And it was actually very enjoyable. And when I look back on the process, even though there were moments that kind of were up and down and hard to take that journey, I discovered the joy that is a part of completing that process. We're talking about that today, and when we think about the joy that is part of our lives when we've followed through on something, or when we've followed through on things we know we want to do and they've created joy in our lives, we also, on the other side, have regret when we've not followed through on things that we know we want to do. And there are regrets that come with moments that are a part of times where we've said things like, I should have called, or I should have said something different, or I should have stayed. And so when we think about this season, really the joy that is part of this season that we sing about is something that we want to engage with. And we're going to discover today a part of that has to do with an inconvenient journey. And the joy of the season really does depend on it. Now, this series in Advent, we've been looking at familiar Christmas songs, and these Christmas songs have something to say about Jesus, and what they reflect about Jesus is important for us to be able to look at. Today, we're looking at the song, Away in a Manger. Now, Away in a Manger is a very famous song. Many of you have heard that song somewhere along the way. It seems to have been published as a poem in a Boston publication called The Myrtle in 1884. Now, at this point, whether it was well known before that or not, it had actually been published there as if it was the Lutheran Cradle Hymn, or Luther's Cradle Hymn. Now, this is Martin Luther they're talking about, the reformer in Germany, not Lex Luthor, the arch enemy of Superman. And so just make sure that you understand that Lex Luthor and Martin Luther are two very different individuals. But it seems that as they dug a little bit deeper over the last number of years, they really couldn't find a lot of substantiation to Martin Luther's authorship. And we're not really sure that he ever really made a claim to writing this particular song. Why the publication gave him credit, we can only kind of make assumptions about. There are connections to German Lutherans that are in Pennsylvania. There's connections to anonymous authors. And although the authorship of this song, Away in a Manger, is in question, there are multiple options and multiple credits for the tune. As a matter of fact, one of the earliest tunes that was associated with it was a Civil War song called Home Sweet Home. The folk song was the tune to which this song was sung. Also, a pastor and author by the name of Jonathan Spillman wrote a version of the medley for this song at one time. Also, a guy by the name of James Murray, James R. Murray, wrote a melody line that is crediting, at that point, it's back to being Luther's Cradle Hymn. Now, Spillman had written something, and another hymn writer by the name of William Kirkpatrick, he wrote a melody line as well that was adapted from Spillman. And so there were a number of different authors that did things even before 1900. And so by the time we get to 1951, one particular journalist and author compiled all of the tunes that he could find that had been designated as the way you sing Away in a Manger. And he suggested in his articles that there were as many as 41 different tunes to the song Away in a Manger. Now, the two most common variations that we might be familiar with would be one of them that is familiar in North America, that was the Spillman-Kirkpatrick version, and then one that is familiar in the United Kingdom, which is the Murray version. But this song really appeared as a song on its own in 1885, and even today in the United Kingdom, in a recent survey, it was listed in the top 5 most loved Christmas songs around this time of year. Now, for me, hearing this song, there's always one line in there that I never really understood, and I did a little bit of digging into what it meant. When it said, "The cattle are lowing." Now, that's not a word that we typically use in this generation. Over 100 years later, the cattle are lowing. Now, some of you may be familiar with what it means for cattle to be lowing. But after a little bit of research, I discovered it was a very simple answer, and that is the cattle were mooing. And it's a way to express that. And so what I also discovered is something that, not having grown up on a farm, was important to understand, and that is that cows really only moo when there's something out of the ordinary happening, when they're sending a message like get out of the way, or there's a threat, when they're seeking to find each other like a mother and a calf. And so in this particular song, "The Cattle Are Lowing" is actually making a statement that something unique and something important enough to be recognized is happening here. Now, the birth of Jesus is an endearing picture, and it's really painted beautifully in this song. It's really kind of an awe moment, isn't it? Like, awe, isn't that really, really sweet? And it's immortalized by living nativities and sculpted and painted and handcrafted and all kinds of images and figurines where the baby is safe and welcomed with all kneeling and attention being given toward this beautiful child. But the baby grew up and became a very challenging persona. His teaching created a lot of waves. And he really challenged the status quo and moved people from where they were to engage with God. And sometimes when we see the manger, we kind of get all of that. And the inconvenient journey that Jesus took, as well as some of the other journeys that are a part of the story, really show up in the midst of this time, and we're reminded of them in the poetic moments of this song. Now, if we're kind of looking for our understanding of what happens next, that Jesus shows up on the scene and he is kind of an inconvenient speaker, and he wrestles and challenges a lot of the thinking of the day, we recognize that at this moment it seems like even the livestock in the song know that there's something important that's happening here. Today, in our sequence of Advent, as we think about the Magi, we hear about them in the book of Matthew, and they're making this long trip from the east. We know that they're really smart or intelligent kind of people, and we've also discovered that they recognize what's happening here, and it's important enough for them to take this really long journey. We don't have a lot of information. Everything we have is right there in the book of Matthew. The Bible isn't even specific about how many of them were present. We kind of assume that there was 3 because there was 3 gifts, but there was at least 2 because Matthew outlines that they were more than 1, but they could have been more than 3. There could have been several. As a matter of fact, there are a number of kind of thoughts about who they actually were even in the first place. So one of the thoughts is that they may have been astrologers from the east, people who studied the stars but also studied them with the eye on predicting the future, which was really a whole practice that God had condemned in the Old Testament. Well, some could also think that they were wise men and that they were advisors for the Eastern Parthian Empire, and that was kind of based in what we know as modern-day Iran and Iraq. Now, some also think they could have been early students of the simple science of astronomy, and the science of astronomy and how they were scientists of the day, really starting to discover what it meant to understand the stars and their significance and what they had to be able to share with us as far as the heavens were concerned at that particular point. Any way you slice it, wherever it is that they came from, whatever their history was, and whatever it is that was going on, they were outsiders to the Hebrew culture and to the lineage. And so they were another group of unlikely people who were engaging here in God's story. Like the shepherds, they discovered something about what was going on that they needed to pursue. And as they took the long journey from where they came from, they discovered the joy at the end of the journey was worth the challenge. Now, it's fascinating how the Magi studied the star to be able to discover its significance. Some would suggest that maybe some of the writings that they explored were a part of the earlier exile that Daniel was involved in hundreds of years earlier. And so there are questions, because there certainly wasn't a Google hookup to be able to say, I've seen a star in the sky, and I want to see what it is I need to do to deal with this. No, they got on their way after they had discovered and understood the significance, and it was a fairly interesting process, I'm sure, that they went through to do that. Now, they don't seem to arrive quite in sync with the night of Jesus' birth. It was at least slightly after, maybe quite a while afterwards, and Matthew gives us a hint in this way when he writes in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, and helps us to see that Jesus and Mary and Joseph are now living in a house, and that's where the Magi eventually find them. But it wouldn't have been an easy trip at all. If they were coming from the area of Iran or Iraq, they would have been coming at least 1,000 miles, and depending on how fast they traveled, it could have taken quite some time, as we've mentioned. They knew it was a magnitude 10 event, and they had to be there. They didn't brush it off. Now, maybe it's quite a distance, and, they could have had some of those kind of thoughts like we've had sometimes. Maybe we'll just follow the next new star. This looks like this one's going to be quite a ways away. No, they chose to keep going. They didn't want to miss it, and they responded with action. They took the journey, and they discovered the joy. Now, in contrast, we've got Herod in this account as well. And he was the king who was right there on the scene, wasn't he? And many people in Israel missed this as well. Verse 3 says, King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, the Magi asking about this new king. And so was everyone in Jerusalem. And he called a meeting of the leading priests, and I'm sure he was a little bit frustrated when he asked the question, where is this Messiah supposed to be born? Herod is wondering, how could I miss this? It's happening right under my nose. Did you guys just look over this star and say, no big deal? Did you even notice it? I'm sure there were a lot of questions at that point. We have a GPS in our car. And if you have a GPS that you've traveled with, then perhaps the talking feature on the GPS has kind of caught you from time to time. And for me, it seems like turning that off was really a good idea, because the talking and the constant speaking in the background felt like a bit of a nuisance to me. And so even now we keep it off most of the time. That hasn't always worked out as a good thing, though, because there have been times when I've been driving and, we'll get talking in the car and kind of communicating with each other, or we'll get thinking about something else, and all of a sudden we realize we've missed the exit because we haven't paid attention to the GPS, and it wasn't talking, we'd had it silenced. And so as a result of having it silenced, we missed an exit or missed a turn, and we'd have to circle back, and that's not always been real easy. There are times when I've wondered, well, maybe I should just turn it back on. If I just listened to the voice, then, it would be better. Herod seems to be blinded by jealousy, doesn't he? And as a result, he thinks that this is a threat to his agenda for the kingdom, a threat to his family continuing to possess the throne at this point. The Magi, on the other hand, they're not threatened. As a matter of fact, they go looking and they seek out where they can find Jesus. And as they do, they reap the reward. They discover the joy of this inconvenient and challenging journey that they have taken in order to arrive at a place where they can connect with Jesus. Now, it's interesting how sometimes in our lives we can be distracted and maybe have our own agendas as well, and sometimes we miss the invitation that Jesus is bringing to our lives to experience the joy as we engage with Him. One author that you may be familiar with, his name is C.S. Lewis. He is most famous for writing stories that are found in the Chronicles of Narnia. He made a statement that for all of us, we have to come to the conclusion as to whether or not Jesus is a liar, or is he a lunatic, or is he exactly who he claims to be, and should he be worshipped as Lord? Now, if he's who he claims to be, then it demands a response. And in the case of the Magi, their response was to take the inconvenient journey that was necessary to discover the joy of engaging with God. It was inconvenient, as we mentioned, challenging, purposeful, sometimes even risky. But the beauty of the completed moment was to discover that they were engaging with the heavenly. Herod's response, on the other hand, was to kind of shut it down. I mean, he saw it as a threat. This lunatic is destroying my plans for the kingdom, and he must be silenced. Many others in Israel, as Matthew kind of alludes here, they're kind of disturbed that there would be this other king, and they weren't even aware that anything else was happening. Maybe they were upset. Maybe they were just like, babies are born all the time, right? No big deal here. But ultimately, what they expected to see was what they saw. They either saw a king, they saw a threat, or they saw a child that was of no consequence whatsoever. So what is it that we expect to see? When we look at Jesus here in this time, do we see a child that's just kind of a quaint moment that can be generally ignored the rest of the year? Kind of the way, we kind of celebrate Jesus' birth right now, and then we kind of let him fade from our attention the rest of the year. Maybe a little bit like a Facebook birthday celebration, right? Maybe we see him as a threat, and we tend to find ourselves pushing away and ignore him or seek to discredit or silence his influence in our lives or even around us. Or do we see him as king, one to whom we need to give our whole selves, our lives to him, to engage with the reality of Jesus, like the Magi? And that's where we discover the joy that refreshes beyond this season. To engage with his agenda in our lives, to pay attention to his activity, to participate in God's grand story in the way that the Magi did. Because this is not the story of the Magi that we're talking about here. This is God's story of him connecting with another unlikely group of people. Although the shepherds represent people that we would consider to be more down and out in the story of Jesus and how he connected with them and messaged them and invited them to his side. The Magi represent the up and out, the powerful and intelligent, and the message that was received as he is speaking about himself through the star to invite anyone who will listen. And in a way that they could understand, he helps them see that he is welcoming them to himself, to engage in the joy of Jesus. That isn't necessarily the easiest journey, but it's an opportunity for the people around us to engage with him, and for us as well to engage with the joy that he longs to continue to refresh in our lives. Now, there are probably some people in your world that are far from acknowledging Jesus. They probably are still in that point of considering whether or not they believe Jesus is a liar that just needs to be ignored, or a lunatic that needs to be kind of silenced. But nothing is kind of cuter than this baby in a manger. And in the midst of that, God is speaking and inviting us on an inconvenient journey to discover the joy of engaging with him. It's inconvenient because it's hard to sometimes get started. And even when you're going, it's sometimes hard to keep going, because it's like anything in life that is worthwhile to do. There are challenges along the way. There are moments when you wonder, have I even got what it takes to keep going here? Have I got what it takes to get started? And we come to this time of Christmas, and we recognize that in many ways it has become a bit of a nice, beautiful time for us. In many cases, in ordinary times, we gather together, and if we pay attention, in the familiar times that we find ourselves in, we can hear the call of Jesus inviting us to himself. To make a decision about our response means we have to decide whether we're going to ignore him as a liar. No big deal. This is just another cute moment, and we'll celebrate it again next year. Or whether we're going to silence it and try to not only ignore it, but push it away from our lives because Jesus is some kind of lunatic that is just upsetting my personal worldview? Or is Jesus Lord? And will we take the journey that he is inviting us to take? Like the Magi, it may be inconvenient, it may be long, it may be risky, it may involve a lot of challenges along the way. But the beauty of the journey is in realizing that discovering the joy, the refreshing joy that Jesus longs to instill in our lives that goes far beyond this season, is a part of the discovery of trusting and engaging with him. As I take a few moments to pray with you here right now, I want to pray specifically for those of you who are in that decision-making process, that are trying to sort out whether or not you believe Jesus is a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. And for some of you who have decided maybe intellectually that he's Lord, there are maybe some areas of the journey that you're still sorting through and saying yes to and engaging with him. And so I also want to pray for you as well. Let's take a few minutes and pray together. Jesus, thank you for your goodness to us. Thank you for coming to earth and taking the inconvenient journey of showing up as a human and allowing us to engage with you and to discover the connection that we can now have to you as a result of your birth, your life, your death, and your resurrection. And Jesus, it is so significant for us as we think about what it means to see joy continually refreshed in our lives beyond this season. And so we come to you today, and for those of us who have struggled through that process of whether you are a liar, a lunatic, or whether you are Lord, and as we continue on that journey, I pray that you'll help us as we take the steps toward you to better engage in what you're asking us to do. And in the moments when we step back and maybe push away, I pray that you draw us in again. And for those who we love, or some who may be listening who are still kind of on the fence, whether you're a liar to be ignored, whether you're a lunatic to be silenced, God, I pray that you would help as you draw those people to yourself to speak, and help them to understand that you're speaking to them and that you love them and you're drawing them to yourself in the same way you drew the Magi over a long and arduous journey. And we thank you, and we praise you, and we trust you today. In your name I pray. Amen. At the beginning of this video, we mentioned the podcast extras, and they're found in the description section of both YouTube and Facebook. There's a link there that'll take you to our website and allow you to connect with a video version of Away in a Manger, as well as some other songs that are a part of the day. Also in there, if you are following along, as you may have your own personal Advent wreath at home, today is the day where we light the candle of joy. And there are some scripture readings that you can follow through on that are found in those podcast extras if you would like to follow up and engage in that way as well. There's a variety of other links there to engage with us as a congregation, and we'd love for you to follow through and send us a message along the way as to how God is working in your life, or if you want someone to pray with you or for you, then feel free to share those in that setting. Once again, thank you for joining us here today. It's been great to be able to connect with you in this way. And we look forward to continuing to connect with you over these next few weeks. I will mention that our Christmas Eve service will be posted here on both YouTube and Facebook. That will be coming up on the 24th. It'll be available around noon on that day. And so we look forward to the opportunity to be able to share in music and in message, as well as in story during that day. Some of the elements of our usual live setting will be a part of that. There are some elements that won't translate, but we look forward to having that opportunity to be with you and to celebrate on Christmas Eve together. And so we look forward to engaging there as well. If you don't mind taking a moment to like, comment, or share this video, that would be fantastic. And we pray for you, and I trust that you're continuing to pray for us as we take these days to continue to minister God's blessings in the places that we live, work, play, and where we learn. And we'll see you again soon.